earlier because of a confusion with time. And one of our panelists is getting some equipment. So we're going to go ahead and get started right now. And so I'm going to pass the mic over to Jenny. No. Oh, Curtis, you're going to start. So let me give the microphone over to Curtis, and he's going to start, and then we'll start with the presentations and the Q&As. And I want to thank you all very, very much. This is a very important topic, especially for those of us who live here in South Florida, where many people assume that this is a sensitive subject because of hurricanes, because of the Atlantic Ocean, but we're actually surrounded by water on a bunch of different sides, including under us and including the Everglades, and that's just talking about water. Climate change and sustainability and resilience is a lot more than that, but these are the experts, not I.
Well, welcome to Miami, also known as ground zero for climate change. In addition to all the natural impacts that could happen here, we've got, I don't know how many $1 billion worth of real estate that is at risk. So, and real estate drives the Florida economy, so it's a very high interest topic in South Florida. I did note that the panel is called Climate Change New Journalistic Beat. That's not exactly correct. The Miami Herald, Jenny's a former environmental reporter, I'm a former environmental reporter, going back 30 years, and this newspaper has covered climate change for decades. In fact, we had a gardening writer, Georgia Tasker, did some of the pioneering work on climate change in the 1990s and early 2000s, and I think there's a headline up here, Ground Zero for Climate Change. That story was published by the Miami Herald in the year 2000. And all these stories were 2000 to 2005, and frankly, the story's the same, the facts are the same, the predictions are worse, and I think what's new about the way the media is covering climate change is the editors and the policymakers are starting to pay attention for the first time. So what's new for us is this used to be something that was a side beat for an environmental reporter or a gardening writer, and now we have a first climate change reporter that we think in the state and devoted to it specifically. That's Alex here. And the largest newspapers in Florida also have gotten together to form the Florida Climate Change Reporting Network. This was inspired by another effort by the paper's editorial boards last year called the Invading Sea, where the leaders of these newspapers, the top editors and publishers, recognize that this is a huge issue for Florida. The future of the state depends on how we deal with it. And so they begin to share and collaborate on editorial content and opinion pieces. What's new this year is that those same newspapers, the Miami Herald, the Tampa Bay Times, the Orlando Sentinel, the Fort Lauderdale Sentinel, the Palm Beach Post, are also sharing news content. We've added some other partners. Jenny now works for WLRN Radio and News Radio. They're a partner. They're the University of Florida, and how many do we have?
I think we're at like 16, 18 partners now in the Florida Climate Change Reporting Network. It's growing by the day.
Yeah, so the most immediate benefit to that is that with everybody doing all this work, all these outlets can share coverage. It's kind of a new thing for newspapers. We like to be competitive and beat each other and get scoops, but there's a recognition that this is a complicated topic, and we're now able to use everybody's work freely. We're still ironing out projects on how to collaborate, which competing newspapers don't always do so well. But that's the main thing. We've gotten a couple of grants to pursue some large-scale projects where we're going to experiment with collaboration. But that's what's new, and I don't think we're the only state to do this. There's a couple of other journalistic outlets that are also forming climate reporting collaborations. So that's what's new for us. And
so right now, what the is this on? Right now, the news of the collaboration is what we mostly do is we share stories. So you'll see here we have a story that Jenny Staletovich, WLRN, wrote, and the Miami Herald picked up through this partnership. The nuts and bolts of the partnership right now is we have a Slack channel, and all the editors and reporters post what they work on. We share photos, we share the clean text to make it easier to share, and as Curtis said, the next step is we're working on starting to collaborate on reporting original stories together, and that is a little bit in the works. Soon we're going to have a Facebook page where we can share this content. We are one of the first local collaboratives of this climate change reporting. The Pulitzer Center has one, and then Inside Climate News also has one in the Northeast and the Midwest, and they're working on gathering newsrooms together so that they can all start sharing their content as well. The collaboration is the next step, and it takes a little bit more work. So Jenny and I are going to talk to you a little bit about the kinds of climate stories we do. So here at the Herald, we like to do climate stories that are accountability stories. You kind of really, a climate story, a local climate story isn't hard to find. It's not all just looking at these big government reports from the UN and trying to localize them, although that's a part of it. It's looking at the ways that climate change affects the people who live in your community. So that's, this woman wants to elevate her house because it's flooded several times in a hurricane, but local zoning codes don't allow her to do it. It's talking to someone whose house was wiped away by one of these major hurricanes and saying, do you want to come back to this zone? Do you want to rebuild? So what we try to do is we focus a lot on pocketbook issues, how flood insurance raising because the National Flood Insurance Program has poor finances and is not properly calculating the risk from sea level rise. That may, change in the next year or two. And how would that affect you as a resident of South Florida in one of the most vulnerable areas in the country to sea level rise? So we really try to do human-focused stories. Solutions-focused stories are really important for us too, because that's what research shows that readers and audience really respond to. I think if you talk about climate change from just a gloom and doom perspective, people are turned off. They think, oh, it's going to happen anyway. There's nothing I can do. So it's nice to be able to talk about things that are happening in a positive way, solutions that are out there. What is your local government doing, or what are they not doing to save you? And then we also, I want to talk a little bit about how to broaden your audience, because I think people like to think that climate change stories are really hyper-local, they're environmental stories, and they belong only there. But they're really a lot broader. They're real estate stories. Curtis was talking about how many billions of real estate we have at risk here. So you can think about them as business stories. You can think about them as economic stories. They can be social stories, which nationalities, races, classes, creeds are going to be affected differently. And you can really come at this from a bunch of different ways. And what we found really works, and what works for other communities around Florida, is you have to find the thing, right here, that your region is uniquely concerned about. Are horses a really big part of your economy in this tiny county in central North Florida? Well, why don't you write about the fact that mosquito-borne diseases could make your population of horses more vulnerable, and that therefore could hurt your economy? Is your economy dependent on tourism? Well, will tourists come if stronger hurricanes are wiping out the hotels they like to stay at? So it really comes down to trying to find things that are unique about your community and being able to turn that into a story that makes people care about an issue that maybe they didn't think they needed to care about. So Jenny, you want to talk about what you look for in climate change stories?
A lot of that. And then because I primarily started as an environmental reporter, I still look at things a lot through an environmental lens. And I think it's really important for people to understand not just what's in their front yard, but what's under them, what's around them, what they can't see. Florida is particularly vulnerable because we're such a low-lying place and surrounded by water and underwater. So I tend to like to take people places where they wouldn't normally go, like out in the middle of the marshes or the swamps, and show them just how much we are altering the planet with some of the things that are happening. And I think you can bring those home to people. Radio is great because people actually hear the scientists' own voices, or hear anglers, or hear the people who are really at the forefront of a lot of these changes.
Thank you very much. And we also have somebody here from Brazil, which is another country that is extremely important in our hemisphere, and also is dealing with many of the issues that we were speaking about this morning. And so we'd like to ask you if you could give us a few words, and then we'll start with questions and answers.
Ok.
Could somebody give him a microphone, please?
Sim.
Oh, he's got one.
Okay. Vou falar em português. É uma honra estar aqui participando do painel junto com jornalistas especializados na cobertura do meio ambiente. Mas eu sou de outra área, eu sou de política, eu sou especializado em política. E vim aqui, na verdade, porque uma reportagem que eu fiz, que mereceu o prêmio, é sobre meio ambiente e um grande problema no interior do Brasil. Como em todas as áreas de interesse da sociedade, o que acontece com o meio ambiente está diretamente relacionado com as decisões políticas. Eu tentarei contribuir, portanto, falando um pouco sobre como os governos interferem nas questões ambientais e também sobre as consequências dessa interferência. Especificamente, sobre mudanças climáticas, o Brasil contribui com as causas dos desequilíbrios e também sofre as consequências. Os dois maiores biomas do Brasil são a Amazônia e o Cerrado. Nos últimos meses, o mundo tomou conhecimento das grandes queimadas de grande proporção na Amazônia brasileira. Esse é um fenômeno conhecido que se agrava com o aquecimento global. A ocupação desordenada da região de floresta está diretamente ligada às decisões políticas e econômicas. O avanço das fazendas de agronegócio se dá de forma predatória e irresponsável, com danos para o meio ambiente e para as comunidades indígenas. A extração ilegal de madeira e de minérios e as queimadas reduzem drasticamente, ano após ano, a cobertura florestal da região. Em 2019, o novo governo brasileiro, que tomou posse em janeiro, deu mais um impulso para a destruição da mata. A ordem é avançar sobre a floresta e sobre as reservas indígenas. O discurso radical contra os setores que atuam na preservação da floresta e a redução da fiscalização são fatores decisivos para o estímulo às queimadas da mata. Entre os setores que apoiam o governo federal estão os empresários do agronegócio da Amazônia. Esse é um segmento que se destaca pela produção pecuária, uma das principais fontes de gases que contribuem com o efeito estufa. E também o agronegócio que domina o Cerrado, tema da reportagem que mereceu a premiação da CIP. Nesse caso específico, as grandes fazendas ocupam ilegalmente terras públicas, financiam seus empreendimentos com dinheiro público e contam com a conivência dos governos e das autoridades. Como podemos ver, tudo é política. Também são políticas as decisões que permitiram as atividades de mineração que contaminam as águas e provocam as catástrofes monumentais, como as que ocorreram no Brasil, em Brumadinho, no início deste ano, e em Mariana, em 2015. Tanto na Bahia, onde se dá a história contada na reportagem que fizemos, quanto nos grandes desastres da mineração, uma das consequências mais nefastas é a morte dos rios. E apenas finalizando, creio que com esses casos locais, um pouco dentro do que os colegas falaram, acho que é possível, a partir desses fenômenos, desses desastres e desses conflitos, acho que entender um pouco. O Brasil é um país de dimensões quase continentais e todos esses problemas tomam, por isso, uma dimensão maior. Obrigado.
Thank you very much. Pido un aplauso por los presentadores. And I would like a Q&A session, and I would like to start from the very beginning. You spoke about Florida and the work that's been done in the last 30 years, making the point that it's not a new thing. And you spoke about the politics, you both spoke about the economics, about money being behind some of the actions that we as a race, the human race, take that have affected the climate and the planet. For someone who has doubts, has an open mind, but has doubts, we constantly hear that the science is clear, but very rarely ever actually see the science. We see, of course, the hurricanes. We live in South Florida. I live here. We see the effects of things. But my question to you is there in fact a doubt among the majority of scientists that man-made pollution is affecting the planet in a way that wouldn't have happened had we not been here, given the fact that climate has never been a static thing? Anybody who wants to take on that question, please.
No. I talked to a lot of scientists. There have been a lot of stories written about the fact that 99% of scientists agree that the changes that we are seeing on a warming planet are anthropogenic, that they are caused by increasing emissions that are warming the planet. The amount, the projections, there may be some debate, for example, among the changes in the precise things in hurricanes. There's things to tease out, but the overall picture is that the warming that we are seeing in the planet now that started at with the industrial age is caused by human activity.
And so you're saying only 1% of scientists disagree?
I don't know what the percentage is, but I will say the overwhelming majority. And scientists usually do things by consensus. That's why we get peer-reviewed journals. They go out to a panel. Usually a peer review is done by experts in the same field so that they can raise questions about the findings in the paper. There's a lot of disagreement. Different journals operate differently, but the scientists I talk to anyway, they tend to debate these things. They're pretty open about picking apart each other's findings, and that's where I'll let you go. I'll ramble on. Sorry.
I was going to add, I think Jenny is right, and one of the ways that journalism has changed, since this is a journalism conference, is I think 20 or 30 years ago, a lot of these stories would have more of a he said, she said, opposing points of view in these stories. I don't think that's the case anymore with mainstream media. The science is overwhelming, and the reason that the coverage has shifted isn't just that the science is overwhelming, it's just that the policymakers all over the United States and all over the world are seeing these impacts. So the question, atmospheric science and what is causing all this happening is over the heads of almost everybody in this room. I'm not an atmospheric scientist. But I've lived in Miami for 60 years, and Jenny and I were talking a little earlier about how in my lifetime, which is very short in geological terms, I've seen massive changes in the environment here. The reefs of South Florida used to be full of staghorn and elkhorn coral forests that I snorkeled on and scuba dived on when I was 10, 12, 15 years old. They're gone. Now, is it exactly climate change that has changed that? No, there's a lot of diseases and other things like that, but the consensus among marine scientists is that the increased temperature of oceans has driven these changes and increased the vulnerability of corals. So there's just reams and reams of data that suggest that climate change is driving most of the things that were happening in the environment. Hurricanes, it's a very complicated kind of thing. But there's also a lot of money at stake with the fossil fuel industry and a lot of reasons to pay experts to sort of add smoke to the picture, and that worked for a long period of time. But I think even those industries are changing their tune now. I get Barron's magazine just put out something about a whole magazine on sustainability as the future. Businesses and industries are accepting that they're going to have to change. How they're going to do it, the costs and everything else are a open question.
Let me play devil's advocate. Why do people, and this is really my own personal question, it's my own personal beef, why do people continue to pay $10 billion for a condominium on Miami Beach?
Ooh, do we have any realtors here?
So just in case no one heard the end of that question, why do people pay $10 million for a condo on Miami Beach? Well, they're not going to live there in 50 years. This is the wealth that they can get in and get out really quickly. So real estate is really complicated, and obviously it depends more on the market being what people's perception of it is, and maybe the perception hasn't tilted all the way yet. The science is super clear. The seas are rising. That house you own that is on the water, especially in Southeast Florida, is gonna flood more in the future. There's how much exactly, when it will come, is still up for debate. It's one of those things scientists know is happening. You can't exactly say in 10 years, in 30 years, in 50 years. That's not as clear yet. But people keep buying those homes because they aren't paying attention to the science or they know it financially will not affect them. $10 million, usually if you're gonna spend that much on a mansion in Miami Beach, you have a lot more money and that's not gonna hurt you if your mansion floods.
Okay. You mentioned, Ilmano, the fires in your country. At that very precise time, there was huge fires in Africa, which unfortunately the media, we failed on that. We didn't cover that. I ask you the question because they were both extremely important events to layer on top of things that we are doing post-industrial age. Have we gone to the point of no return where anything that we can do as a human race can change the situation and bring us to a point of stability where a lot of these horror stories that we're hearing that are reality could be averted?
Sobre a Amazônia, sobre o fogo, sim? Creio que está diretamente relacionado o aumento do calor, ano a ano, aumenta o fogo na Amazônia. A cada ano que passa, se torna um problema mais grave. Acho que isso tudo está diretamente relacionado. No Brasil, nós não temos problemas com furacões, praticamente. Nos últimos anos, chegamos a ter alguns. Mas, sem dúvida, o que acontece na Amazônia está diretamente relacionado ao aquecimento global e, com isso, a nossa floresta, cada dia, corre mais risco. E ainda mais diante das novas orientações do governo, que não são pela preservação, como eu disse na minha apresentação, mas que a cada dia nos preocupa mais. A Amazônia é o principal problema, mas também em outras áreas isso se manifesta, creio.
Does anybody else have any other comments?
So just last week or the week before the UN's, United Nations International Panel on Climate Change released their latest report on ocean health and ice melt. And in these projections, they actually talk about different scenarios where if we lower carbons to a certain amount, like, no change, limit carbon some amount and then limit it more, and there are windows. And so what they're sort of advising is if we reach certain numbers in terms of limiting carbon, we can slow things down. There are some things that are already baked into the system, but if we can slow it down, then we can give ourselves time to prepare. So there are some things like sea rise, which is something you can prepare against. You can build infrastructure, you can relocate people. There are other things that maybe are not so easy to control.
Do we have any questions? Yes, we do have some questions from the audience, and I'll give you my mic.
Hi. Does climate change present any opportunities as well as risks? It's one question. And two, there are some specific Florida hazards, coral reef degradation, groundwater contamination, warmer seas, hurricanes, algae bloom, et cetera. Are there some specific Florida remedies?
So in terms of thinking about solutions-oriented, a way of approaching climate change stories, that's a great question about opportunities, because one of the biggest opportunities that economists are starting to realize and the business community is realizing is that you can transition to clean energy. So that means energy that is made without burning any fossil fuels. So that's nuclear, that's solar, that's wind, that's tidal, and those are huge industries. They're just booming in terms of jobs that people can take, in terms of investments you can make. There are whole parts of the financial market now that come up with green bonds where you can invest in a slew of companies that all work in clean energy, work in sustainability, work in those kind of fields. There's a booming field for architects and designers and landscape architects that can create the homes and businesses and cities of the future that have salt-tolerant plants that don't die every time they flood, that have homes that are elevated above, that have more efficient air conditioning and more efficient roofs that stay on for a hurricane. There's a lot of business opportunities, if you want to talk about it that way, and there are new communities, and people move inland because they can't live in the Keys and Miami forever. They're going to have to move inland at some point. That's an opportunity for you to build a city that is more amenable to a larger population of people, and you can really, if you think out forward, you really can know that there are certain factors that are going to change the world the way we live in it now. And if you start now, you can kind of start designing a better world, and you can start designing a cleaner energy system and a better living space that really applies to most of climate changes.
What about the poor countries, the countries that can't do those things? And then I'll pass the microphone on.
That wasn't the question I was expecting.
Neither was I.
No, I mean, there's massive challenges. I mean, I'm going to answer the opportunity question first, and then maybe we can segue to this. I wanted to give a very concrete example of the opportunities are, there's a whole adaptation industry being developed in Florida in terms of how to harden your house, raise your house. There's resilience planners and things like that that are all along the same line. So, you know, America has always been innovative to deal with challenges, and I think there's new technologies and new things that are going to develop. And the concrete example is, if any of you are golfers and you get an opportunity to play at the Miami Beach golf course, the turf there is called paspalum. That was developed specifically to grow with brackish water, because the water table under Miami Beach had been invaded by the ocean, and it wasn't fresh anymore. So I think it was the University of Florida, their agronomy department or something, that developed this strain that grows in brackish and salt water. And so that turf is now sold to many coastal communities. So those are the opportunities to adapt to things. In terms of how to deal with poor countries, I think that's not something that I've studied. There's obviously dirty, cheap kind of energy that poor countries rely on. I mean, Haiti, for instance, has burned half of its forests and deforested the country, which is not helping it. That's a problem probably out of my pay grade. I don't have an answer for it at the moment. I don't know if anybody else does.
So when it is what you say, you know, the opportunities and the opposite of opportunities for poorer countries is, yes, they are left out of the equation for now. So the way the world is adapting to climate change, or failing to adapt to it, will hurt those poorer nations first. You see the world leaders of Micronesia, of Kiribati, showed up at the UN climate meeting recently in New York, and they argued strenuously that this is something the world needs to commit to quickly, because they're going to feel the impacts first. Some of these countries, even if we stand to stay within the most ambitious of our goals, which is keeping the world under 1.5 degrees Celsius of temperature rise by the end of the century, that still is going to raise seas a couple feet. And that could be just enough to put some of these islands completely underwater, displace millions of people, and change the economy for them and the way they've lived for centuries. And that's if we do everything right. So really, some of these communities, the conversation tends to be, in the United States, very focused on Miami and New York and some of the other wealthier communities that are adapting in ways that they are able to because they have the cash. But that's not the reality for most of the world. Or the Netherlands is another good example. People love to look at the Netherlands and how the Dutch are adapting, but it's because they're extremely wealthy and they have 500 years of experience in this topic. And that's not something the rest of the world shares, and it's something that the global conversation really needs to turn toward.
Hello, Ricardo Trotti, Inter-American Press Association. I have a couple of questions. One would be, how do you rate Floridian legislators and governors? If you can give us a scale, even if you can name specific names of senators or national legislators and local legislators, or I mean Floridian legislators, who are the ones that helping most in this issue? Which ones are still denying? And please include the governors, last couple of governors. I believe that's important for us.
I'll give you an opening, which is Florida doesn't have, I'm sorry.
No, and the second question would be about Greta phenomenon, how she is helping, or how her message is being polarized by politicians too. And so, what do you think? She's helping residents to understand the issues, or really politicians too?
Well, on Greta Thunberg, I will say she is probably drawing a lot more attention, especially during her recent visit, than would have otherwise happened, especially for this UN report that just came out. I mean, she just drew a lot of attention. As far as Florida goes, I was going to say, you know, we do not have a great history with environmental issues, let alone climate change. This is a state that its economy is based on growth. We used to do a better job at land planning. Rick Scott, who's now a senator, did away with part of the government that handled land planning, and that changed how regions cooperated with their growth. That was a huge, huge change and a huge loss. As far as specifics, I'm going to hand that over to Chris.
All right. Well, Jenny mentioned Rick Scott, who famously, we think this is true, and I'm almost positive it's true. It's been reported that he banned the term climate change in state literature. That didn't cover every agency, but it was difficult to get a state official to talk about climate change when he was the governor. The new governor, Ron DeSantis, came in and has immediately lifted that, appointed a statewide resiliency manager who may or may not be qualified, and a state science officer, and climate change is, once again, are words that you can use talking with state officials. What else he's going to do, whether or not the budget for climate change in Florida, I believe Alex reported, was like $5 million. That's a drop in the bucket. So, and Rick Scott, even though he denied climate change in the past, is now he's in Washington. He also has a mansion on Naples Beach, by the way. He's now kind of acknowledging that this might be an issue that we have to take a look at. The tipping point, or the litmus test for them, though, is accepting the idea that this is man-made change. That's something that they still haven't gone forward with. They're acknowledging that this is happening. Across the state of Florida, government officials are spending hundreds of millions of dollars on flood control and climate change projects. Miami Beach has almost $1 billion, or at least $500 million of pumps and everything else. So the government officials know it's happening, and they're spending money on it. They wouldn't spend money on it if they didn't think it was a threat. But talking about it in public, particularly with Republican lawmakers, we haven't reached that point yet. I think youngsters like Greta and other young activists are also forcing politicians to look at them as future voters. And so the dialogue is changing. There's this kind of grudging, yes, we may have to do something about this, but we're not sure yet. So the political climate is changing as well. And I think people are going to attack her because that's what we do now on social media and Twitter. We fire off attacks, but they're being pushed that way nonetheless. So I can't point to any environmental heroes or climate change heroes in Florida politics. Former Governor Bob Graham was instrumental in pushing Everglades restoration, which has some climate change elements, and so was Jeb Bush. But nobody's out there. There's no political champion that I'm aware of in Florida.
I mean, the thing about the new governor came into office on the heels of a terrible algae crisis, both in freshwater and saltwater, and so it was like right in his face. I don't think that he could not have done something. I think probably what he's trying to do is strike a balance in his party that has not historically embraced climate change as an issue, between doing what he needs to do for this state and what's acceptable to his party. And I'm so sorry, I have to go.
Jenny has a prior appointment. And now there are a lot of rich Republicans with waterfront properties. So that's one of the motivations as well.
And Brazil? So, in your presentation in Brazil, you talked a lot about politics, and politics and economics are still intertwined. I'm not an expert on this, as you can tell by my line of questioning, and I wish my daughter is, and I wish she was here, but she's out somewhere else. She would have done a better job. But is the overbuilding of sensitive areas. For example, Miami Beach, which in great part was man-made or human-made to begin with. It was a much smaller barrier island, and then we made this big thing on it, and then in recent years, up and down the coast where there used to be 2-story and 3-story family-owned motels, we now put 50, 60, 70-story condominiums on it. Does that have, something to do with it? Because, I hear some of the politicians talk about national and international policies and be very critical of them, yet they sign off on these huge monster buildings. And I'm not an engineer or an architect, but I have a feeling that has to do something with the quality of life and the smell of sewage on South Beach, when it rains a little bit and things like that. Am I incorrect? And if I am, correct me. Whoever would like to take the question.
So yes, you're right. Florida has a long history of clustering more people behind the bullseye and putting more people on the coast where they're in danger. So these new buildings, these monster skyscrapers you see all up and down the beaches and the barrier islands maybe, they're undoubtedly stronger than they were 30 or 40 years ago. We have a really strong wind code. They can better withstand hurricanes. We have a high base flood elevation from the National Flood Insurance Program. They're definitely stronger than those 1- and 2-story buildings are, but they're clustering more people in danger zones, and we're putting more people and we're developing in areas where when those seas rise, they're going to be the first to affect it. And a number of people who lived there 50 years ago is quadrupled. I don't know exactly what the number is, but there's plenty more people in a danger area, and no matter how safe your building is, I think you have to think twice about the risks of doing that.
Yeah, and I think you're asking a question about, is there responsible government? No. I could point, obviously, to Florida, but let's point to Texas. And I think everybody probably saw the story of Hurricane Harvey, which parked over Houston for a couple days and dropped 40 inches of rain. Houston government had approved massive home construction in floodplain zones. The reason they did that is construction is a huge part of the economy. It's a huge part of the economy here. Houston was out of room. Oh, wait, we can put people in these floodplain zones. Well, guess what? When the hurricane came, all those homes were flooded. And so if you look around Florida, I don't know if you're going to go out west towards the Everglades or you drive around the expressway, we have a rock mining industry here, owned by a lot in Latin American countries, by the way, that mines limestone for construction, puts it on railroads and sends it all over the state to support road building and home building. This is a state that historically has been driven by development, and money talks, and so they put homes where people will buy them, and that's what's happened. So there's a couple communities like Boca Raton that have banned construction right on the beach. They've preserved the natural dune line, but Miami Beach, there was once a book about Miami Beach written called The $1 Million Sandbar, because it was dredged material, but it was worth a whole lot of money, $1 million a lot back then. So there have not been responsible decision makings. I think what's going to happen is as those properties flood in vulnerable areas, there's going to be a call to buy them out and retreat. That hasn't happened yet. Flood insurance has bailed people out. But to date, we haven't done a very good job, and Houston is probably the most egregious example lately.
Thank you. We have just a few more minutes. We have a question back here. So if you want to come here, just grab a microphone. Please identify yourself, please.
Thank you. I'm Lana Montalban from Fuente Latina. And everybody in the media says that we are ground zero. Florida is ground zero for everything that will happen in the country due to climate change. My question is very simple. Are we on time, or whatever it is that we're going to do is too late? I recently talked to a NOAA scientist, and he said that the climate change in Florida, we don't have to wait 50 years, like you said, to see it. It's going to be seen in 5 years, and I've been reading this weekend about, rising tides without any rain in places not only in Key West, but in Florida itself. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, if any of you got here a little bit earlier in the week, we had one of our seasonal king tides over the weekend, and it was actually extended a couple of days until like Wednesday, Thursday even. The tides were still really high because of Hurricane Lorenzo way far away, almost approaching Ireland this weekend. The offshore winds were pushing more on shore. So yes, it wasn't raining all weekend, and there was about a couple feet of floodwaters in people's streets. 10% of roads in Miami Beach were covered. It was pretty intense. There was dozens of pumps out there. So we already can see some of those changes, you're right. I don't think it's too late though. I think there's time now that if you start building these projects, you can preserve property value and you can preserve some of the communities. I don't think you're going to be able to preserve everything. The scientists I talk to talk about, there's strategic, it's called managed relocation for a reason. We're not just going to wait until the ocean floods and everyone has to run with whatever they can carry. It's strategic land development and land use and saying, all right, we're going to build our next big condo inland where we're a little drier. We're going to maybe slow down on the development on the beach so we can move people inland. There are going to be baked in consequences, though. Scientists do say that there's going to be a certain amount of this flooding and a certain amount of climate change that, in best case scenario, is still going to happen. And I think Miami by 2100 is going to be a completely different place than it is now, no matter what we do.
Just real quickly, because I know we're about wrapping up. The most difficult question is when, and it's also the most common question. And we're actually starting a project to try to identify some areas and put a better timeline on some of this. But one thing I don't think people understand is when we talk about when's it happening, we're talking about the built environment. It has already happened in the natural world. The Southern Everglades, which most people don't get down to, there used to be a freshwater marshland right up to the coastline. Over the last decades, that has turned into salt, and mangroves, which is a measuring stick of climate change, have marched miles inland in some cases. So these changes, if you were paying attention or if you were scientists who studied or monitored these kind of changes, you could see what has been happening for long periods of time. The Everglades restoration could delay that, but that Everglades area may be the first place to go and the first place to profoundly change. Human ingenuity may give us a lot more time, but some places, as Alex says, will probably not be saved. They'll have to be bought out and turned into buffer zones.
We're almost at the end, so I'd like to ask the three of you to take about a minute and a half or 2 minutes. You have journalists from two sides of the Atlantic, from almost all of the hemisphere, including the Caribbean. What is the most important message in your mind that you can give to these communicators when they leave here, as they go back to their respective countries?
Well, we've heard here that what's going on in the Amazon rainforest may dictate what happens with all the other places that we live, including here in South Florida. I think what I would say is what our newspapers in this state have done by getting together to write about this underlines how critical of a subject this is for all of us. And so we're just trying to figure out how to tell the story in the clearest way so people will understand, and to cut through this fog of disinformation, because there's a lot of it out there. It's motivated by money. Again, look for solutions and press for solutions, because that's what people want from us in the media as well.
Just going to underline that. It's happening. It's real. The science is clear. Go back to your leaders of your community and critically look at what they're doing. Are they helping? Are they hurting? Are they ignoring the problem? If they're ignoring the problem, it's just like ignoring any other social problem that you've got going on. It's going to lead to a worse community in the future. Speak up for your community and talk about the policies that your leaders are doing or not doing, and write about solutions, because that's what people want to hear, and it makes them feel much more engaged in the conversation. And you end up with an audience that really cares more about the topic just because of what you're writing.
Eu acho que a responsabilidade dos jornalistas é muito grande nessa área. A desinformação é grande, há também a proliferação de notícias falsas, distorcidas, as fake news. No Brasil, isso tem um grande impacto na nossa política. E acho que o caminho nosso, acho que foi na antes da apresentação que teve do Mário Garcia, acho que é como contar as histórias, como nós podemos buscar essas histórias nas pessoas, na vida das pessoas. Isso pode estar acontecendo tanto nos países ricos, como nos países pobres, como nos países em desenvolvimento, como o Brasil. Acho que a vida das pessoas é que está mudando muito em função dessas mudanças climáticas. E acho que buscar essas histórias, mostrar o impacto dessas mudanças na vida das pessoas e como as coisas estão acontecendo localmente, que podem se refletir, na verdade, na região, nos países e até no mundo todo. As coisas não são separadas, os países são separados, mas o meio ambiente não. O que acontece no Brasil, aqui na Holanda, acho que nós todos estamos sentindo esses efeitos e acho que cabe a nós, jornalistas, contar essas histórias, saber levar, e é um desafio muito grande, principalmente diante da desinformação que prolifera, principalmente nas redes sociais. Então, acho que aumenta a nossa responsabilidade e aumenta também a necessidade de que recorramos, tenhamos novas linguagens, usemos a tecnologia e consigamos fazer isso para explicar melhor para as pessoas o que está acontecendo, nos apegar aos dados científicos e buscar com isso informar melhor a população. Acho que é isso.
Like an applause for a wonderful, wonderful presentation. I'm sorry we only had an hour and change to do this. This could have gone on for days, and it was fantastic. Thank you.